They took my wedding. Not just the date or the venue, but every piece of it. My dress, my flowers, my guest list. My own mother handed it over like it was never mine. And the worst part, they didn't even tell me. They left a note. 7 words. Wedding's off. Expect a call from my lawyer. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I sent one text. Understood. But inside I was calculating. I called the bank, froze the accounts, pulled every invoice, every contract, every transfer they thought I wouldn't notice. Because when you erase someone like they're nothing, you better make sure they stay quiet. Spoiler, I didn't. While they raised glasses at a wedding built on theft mine, I was posting the truth. With names. With receipts. And when I tell you the silence turned to panic, I mean 67 missed calls in under 2 hours. This story isn't about heartbreak. It's about clarity. It's about what happens when the quiet one stops letting things go. If you've ever been pushed aside, replaced, or made to feel invisible by the people who should have protected you, stay with me. Because what I'm about to share isn't just revenge, it's justice. And once you hear everything they did behind my back, and how I turned it all around without raising my voice once, you'll never look at family loyalty the same way again. Let's begin. Eleanor Monroe was 34, a senior contracts manager at a mid-sized logistics firm in Pennsylvania. Calm by nature, meticulous by training, and fiercely private, she was the kind of woman who showed up early, followed through on her promises, and never let her emotions run ahead of her logic. Her wedding to Daniel, a civil engineer she had dated for 5 years, was scheduled for the following Saturday. It was meant to be intimate family and close friends, a small vineyard she had chosen for its quiet charm, and a simple ceremony that reflected who she was. Nothing extravagant, nothing showy, just hers. That morning she drove across town to her parents' house with a box of sample pastries in the back seat and a small stack of final invitation cards to be hand-delivered. She had told Catherine, her mother, that she'd be arriving at 9:00 a.m. sharp. Catherine had simply replied, "Fine." No exclamation point, no warmth. But that wasn't unusual. Eleanor had grown used to the cold efficiency with which her mother moved through life, especially when it came to her older daughter. Still, she hoped that delivering the final touches of her wedding plans might stir some softness, some pride maybe. When Eleanor pulled up to the familiar white brick colonial, everything looked unchanged. The lawn was tidy, the porch swept, the flagpole empty. But the house itself felt still, too still. She walked to the front door, noticing it was slightly ajar. Not wide open, just unlatched, as if someone had come in quickly and forgotten to pull it shut. She stepped inside. "Mom. Dad." Her voice echoed into silence. No footsteps. No clinking dishes or low TV murmurs from the living room like there usually were when her father watched the morning news. She walked toward the kitchen, her heels clicking softly on the hardwood floor. "It's me. I brought the cake samples." Still nothing. The kitchen was spotless. Immaculate, actually. No breakfast plates, no open newspapers. Just a yellow Post-it note pinned neatly to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a lighthouse from a long-ago family vacation. 7 words. That was all. Wedding's off. Expect a call from my lawyer. No salutation. No signature. But Eleanor knew the handwriting. Her mother's sharp, slanted, severe. The kind of script she used for grocery lists and reprimands. She didn't blink. She didn't even gasp. She stood there for a moment, breathing in the sterile chill of the kitchen. Her fingers clenched around the invitation cards she still held, the edges now creased under pressure. She took out her phone, opened her mother's contact, typed one word, "Understood," then hit send. No questions, no follow-ups. She walked to the back door, opened the trash bin, and gently dropped in the box of pastries. Not angrily, not dramatically, just deliberately. She didn't cry, didn't scream. She wiped her hands on her jeans and walked back through the silent house with a spine as straight as ever. But inside, something cracked. Not shattered. Eleanor wasn't the type to shatter, but split. Like the quiet fault line that finally surfaces after years of pressure. She felt like someone had reached into her chest and scraped out something irreplaceable. Not just the wedding. Not even the betrayal. It was the delivery of it, the coldness, the efficiency. As if she didn't matter enough for a conversation. As if her entire relationship, her plans, her future could be cancelled with a 7-word memo on a fridge. She sat in her car engine off, hands on the steering wheel, for a long time. The invitation card sat untouched on the passenger seat beside her, glaring like an insult. She stared ahead through the windshield, watching nothing, hearing only her own breathing. Shallow even. And then she remembered something. At a birthday dinner 3 weeks earlier, her sister Madeline had made an odd comment while sipping wine during the dress-fitting talk. You know, she'd said, "I think I'd actually look better in that dress. It's more my silhouette." She'd laughed. Everyone had laughed. Eleanor had smiled. But now, that laugh had a different ring. She looked down at her phone again. Her mother's message sat there, clinical and final. This wasn't just a bad decision. This was orchestrated, deliberate. And Eleanor had just been erased from her own story without a second thought. But not for long. Eleanor didn't go to work the next day. She didn't call in, didn't text anyone. She simply stayed curled up on the edge of her sofa, still in the jeans and sweater she had worn the morning before, her phone face down on the coffee table. The silence in the room pressed in around her like a second skin. There was no music, no television, not even the soft clatter of her coffee maker, just the ticking of the kitchen clock in the next room, and the occasional groan of the house settling into its own stillness. She hadn't cried, not really. A few tears had slipped down her cheeks the night before while she brushed her teeth, but it had felt mechanical, like her body was going through the motions, because that's what people did when their wedding was called off with a refrigerator note. But this was something deeper. A stillness she couldn't shake. The couch had molded to her side. The folded invitations were still sitting on the dining table a few feet away, untouched. Her phone had buzzed once or twice, emails probably, no missed calls. Daniel hadn't called. She hadn't reached out to him either. And maybe that said more than either of them wanted to admit. She thought about something Daniel had said a few months earlier while they were leaving her parents' house after dinner. He had put his hand gently on her lower back and said, "Your family's a little different. But I respect them, and I respect what you want with them." At the time, it had made her feel oddly proud. She'd always known her family wasn't warm, wasn't affectionate in the ways Daniel's was, but they were hers. And she had spent most of her adult life believing that being quiet, reliable, and non-confrontational was the way to stay inside the circle. Now she wasn't sure she had ever been in it at all. She finally stood around mid-afternoon and wandered into her small home office, flipping open her laptop more out of habit than intent. Her email inbox was full of the usual work threads, reminders from vendors, updates from her wedding planner. But as she scanned the sender names, something caught her attention. An invoice from the photography company. Except it wasn't addressed to her. It was labeled Monroe Family Event. No mention of her name or Daniel's, just a flat title. She frowned and opened the document. The bill had the correct date, her wedding date, but a different point of contact, her mother's email. At the bottom in the comments section were the words, "Adjust for M." She blinked. Adjust for who? A second invoice from the Vineyard venue arrived moments later. Same structure, same label, same impersonal tone. Eleanor checked her original agreement from months prior. Her name had been on it then. She remembered signing it herself with Daniel present, and Catherine reviewing the package just to make sure everything looked right. She opened her wedding planning folder and began comparing dates, files, and email threads. Bit by bit, it was clear that something had shifted without her knowledge or consent. Several vendors had been quietly switched. The florist she loved was no longer listed. The seating chart had been updated, but she hadn't done it. And the most unnerving part was that all of it appeared to be tied back to a single source, her mother's correspondence. The folder that once gave her joy, the carefully color-coded tabs, inspirational mood boards, Photos of centerpieces now looked like a blueprint for her erasure. Her name was being wiped from her own event, replaced by a generic title, or someone else's. She sat back in the chair and stared at the screen, her heart beating in her ears. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't disorganization. This was purposeful. Suddenly, a moment from her last dress fitting replayed in her mind. Madeline had come along uninvited but welcomed by Catherine. The consultant had brought out Eleanor's chosen gown, a clean, elegant silhouette with subtle beading along the sleeves. Eleanor had been excited to try it again. But before she could step into the fitting room, Madeline had run her fingers across the dress and said with a giggle, "You know, I think this would actually look better on me. It's more my silhouette." Catherine had laughed. "Don't tempt me, Maddie." Eleanor had smiled at the time, brushing it off. Now she wasn't so sure she should have. She rose slowly from the desk and went into the kitchen. Her appetite hadn't returned, but she poured a glass of water, forcing herself to drink. Every movement felt like swimming through wet concrete. She couldn't decide if she was angry or stunned or something more insidious like shame. Not shame that it had happened, but that it had taken her this long to see it. She had always been the steady one, the daughter who didn't complain, the one who worked hard, lived modestly, and never demanded attention, the reliable child. And maybe that's exactly why they had found it so easy to push her aside. Eleanor walked back to the living room and sank into the couch again. She pulled a throw blanket over her lap and stared at the coffee table, her thoughts circling like vultures. She didn't know exactly what was going on yet, but she knew this much. Something wasn't right, and it hadn't been for a long time. The sun had shifted positions in the sky by the time Eleanor stirred from her second long stretch on the living room couch. She hadn't planned on checking her phone again, but the brief buzz against the coffee table was enough to draw her attention. It was a message from Linda. Linda rarely texted during the week unless it was something urgent or strangely funny, usually both. But this time there was no caption, no context, just a screenshot of an Instagram story and one line of text beneath it. "Is this what I think it is?" Eleanor tapped the image. There, centered perfectly in the photo, was Madeline, standing in the mirror at what looked unmistakably like Eleanor's bridal boutique, wearing the exact same wedding dress Eleanor had custom-ordered 6 months earlier. The lace sleeves, the fitted waist, the hemline she had requested to be lowered by 2 inches. Even the pin Eleanor had picked for the back of the neckline was still there, catching the light in the mirror. And the caption read, "Fitting for the big day." Eleanor's breath didn't catch. It stopped entirely. She sat up slowly, phone still in hand, and stared at the screen as if it might change under pressure. But it didn't. The date stamp was today. The location tag matched the bridal shop in town. And Madeline's account was public. There were likes already, comments, reactions. Without thinking, Eleanor stood and walked to her desk. She reached for her old family-shared email login, a relic from her college days mostly used by her parents now to organize holidays and pass around neighborhood updates. She had never been removed from the account. Catherine likely hadn't thought it necessary. She typed in the password. It still worked. The inbox opened and Eleanor's heart picked up pace. Recent messages included subject lines like updated itinerary, catering adjustments, and final print for program. She opened the most recent thread sent from Catherine to a dozen recipients labeled Wedding Team. The attachment, Monroe Family Wedding, Revised Plan. Her hand shook slightly as she opened the file. The document had it all: timeline, seating charts, vendor contact lists, logistics. But the names were different. The bride was listed as Madeline Monroe. The groom, Ethan Harper. Eleanor stared at the groom's name, blinking hard. Ethan. Of course. It made terrible, bitter sense. Years ago, Ethan had briefly dated Madeline, but the relationship had imploded, or so Eleanor thought. Catherine had once suggested quietly that Eleanor meet him, that maybe he was a better fit for her. More grounded, Catherine had said, and business-minded. Eleanor had politely declined. She hadn't liked how Ethan looked through people rather than at them, and Daniel at the time had already filled her life with enough. Now here he was, neatly inserted into a wedding plan that had once belonged to her. Everything else was identical. The venue her vineyard, the floral arrangements her spring palette. The seating chart had most of the same names. Even the officiant was the one Eleanor had personally chosen after meeting 3 different candidates. Nothing had been built from scratch. It had all been lifted, repurposed, reassigned. Except for her. It was as though she had been scrubbed from the entire event like a typo in a family newsletter. Her presence had been a placeholder, a draft, and some group of them had decided that the final version needed to look different. She felt the back of her throat tighten, but no tears came. Not yet. Instead, she opened a blank document and titled it, Record 1. She copied the email, saved the file, took screenshots, backed them up once to an encrypted folder, once to a flash drive. Her breath was shallow, but her hands were steady. If there was pain in this moment, it had gone subterranean. What she felt more clearly was a kind of still fury, a tightening of resolve. She remembered Madeline at that last dress fitting, the playful way she had twirled the hem of Eleanor's gown between her fingers. That line, "I think this would look better on me." Eleanor hadn't realized it then, but that had been a warning, not a joke. She turned back to the screen and read the revised plan again. Her mother had signed the email with the line, "Let's keep this moving smoothly. We're almost there. Almost there." Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment, inhaled deeply, and then returned to her list. She wasn't sure yet what she was going to do with all of this. But she knew one thing now without a single doubt. This wasn't negligence. This wasn't some miscommunication or tragic overlap. It was intentional, calculated. They hadn't just taken her wedding, they had replaced her. Eleanor sat at her desk long after the glow of her laptop screen had dimmed into standby. The house was dark now, the air dense with a kind of quiet that made every small sound seem deliberate. She hadn't moved in hours, only sat there reviewing the same file over and over again, as if each reread might yield some new clue. But there was nothing new. Just confirmation over and over that she'd been replaced. Erased. Her hand drifted to the drawer beneath her desk, pulling it open slowly. Among old keys, tax papers, and half-used checkbooks was a second phone, her older one, the one she hadn't used since upgrading last winter. It still held old photos, voicemails, scraps of her life she hadn't transferred yet. Something tugged at her as she powered it on. The phone buzzed back to life, sluggish from disuse. As she scrolled through folders, she remembered a moment Thanksgiving dinner nearly a year ago. It had been at her parents' house as usual, and the evening had ended in that particular brand of quiet tension that seemed to settle over all Monroe family gatherings. She had left early citing a migraine, but what she hadn't remembered until now was that the phone had been recording. She had accidentally hit record while fiddling with her voice memos app during dessert. She'd discovered it the next day, listened to a minute or two, then forgotten about it. Now she found the file. It began with the clinking of dishes, muffled laughter, then a door closing, chairs sliding back, the sound of footsteps fading, then voices growing clearer. It was her mother, Catherine. "She's gone," she said in a low tone. "Her father." Richard answered, his voice tired. "She didn't seem well." "She's fine," Catherine replied. "Always so restrained. It'll work out for the best." There was a pause, a soft pour of wine. Then Catherine said almost clinically, "Madeline is the long-term investment. Eleanor's fine. But if we need to restructure the Ethan situation, it can be done. We just need to be careful with the timing." Eleanor sat frozen. The words were precise, unemotional, like business strategy, not family. Her father didn't argue. He simply said, "It's risky," to which her mother replied, "Only if she finds out before we're ready." The memo ended with footsteps and a door creaking shut. Eleanor closed her eyes. It was no longer a theory, no longer suspicion wrapped in possibility. They had planned it, not recently, not impulsively, a year ago, maybe longer. It hadn't just been about preference. It had been a deliberate restructuring, a cold rerouting of people's lives to fit some unseen financial or reputational equation. She looked down at the phone, the recording still open, then tapped Save to Archive. She uploaded it to her restitution folder, labeling it Thanksgiving, Confirmation. A slow-burning fury began to move through her, not loud or violent, but steady and absolute. The memory of Ethan came back. She had met him once briefly when Catherine introduced them at a family fundraiser. He was cordial, polished, but calculated. He had shaken her hand like a man sealing a deal. At the time, she hadn't paid much attention to it. She'd already been dating Daniel. Catherine, however, had seemed almost disappointed when Eleanor didn't show interest. Now she understood why. Ethan wasn't just a potential husband. He was a potential asset, a merger opportunity. And Eleanor reserved, principled, cautious Eleanor had refused to play the part. Madeline, though. She was pliable, social, a perfect figurehead for whatever plan Catherine and Richard were stitching together behind closed doors. Eleanor stood and moved toward the bookshelf, scanning titles absently. Her eyes weren't really on the spines. They were looking inward. Suddenly, a rush of smaller memories returned. Times she'd been quietly sidelined. The family trip to Tuscany she hadn't been invited to because, as Catherine said, "You wouldn't have liked the food anyway, darling." The joint birthday party where she'd agreed to share the spotlight with Madeline, only to find her name removed from the cake her gifts handed over as from both of you. The fundraiser she'd volunteered to organize, only to be replaced 2 weeks in because Maddie had fresher ideas. Each time she'd rationalized it. Madeline needed the attention more. Eleanor was the steady one. She didn't mind. She was too busy with work, too introverted for crowds. But now in retrospect, it wasn't benign favoritism. It was grooming, conditioning. A slow, methodical removal of her presence masked by politeness and practicality. She walked back to her desk and opened her notebook, flipping to a fresh page. At the top, she wrote in block letters, "They've been preparing this for years." Below that, bullet points began to form dates, events, patterns. She wasn't just gathering proof anymore. She was building a case. The girl who always stayed quiet had begun to document everything. And this time she wouldn't be erased. The soft hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in Eleanor's kitchen as she sat at the small table, her laptop open in front of her, and the screen casting a faint blue glow across her face. The world outside had fallen quiet. It was well past midnight, but sleep wasn't a possibility. Not tonight. Not after everything she had read, remembered, and uncovered. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, not quite typing yet. She was trying to decide what to name the folder. She settled on one word: restitution. It wasn't revenge, not exactly. It was correction. Balance. A ledger long overdue to be set right. She created the folder, then began dragging in files, screenshots of Madeline's Instagram post, the revised plan email from her mother, invoices that bore her name 1 month and Madeline's the next, and the voice memo from Thanksgiving that still echoed in her mind like a slow rolling thunder. As she worked, her thoughts unraveled in layers, falling into place like puzzle pieces she hadn't known were scattered. It was strange, the moments that resurfaced now. Not the obviously cruel ones, there hadn't been many of those. No yelling, no dramatic rejections. Just the steady drip of being told in 100 small ways that she was not quite enough. Her mother, Catherine, had always dressed Eleanor in beige dresses for Easter, beige slacks for school picture day. "Don't draw too much attention," she would say with a brisk tug of the hem. "There's nothing wrong with being elegant and quiet." But then Madeline would show up in pale pinks and sparkling shoes, all ringlets and ribbons, and Catherine would beam like she'd just won a prize. "She's got such a presence, doesn't she?" she'd say to guests. Later in high school, when Eleanor earned early acceptance to university, Catherine had nodded mildly and said, "Well, of course. You've always been steady. Now help Madeline with her applications, will you? She's still finding her path." Steady. That word again. A compliment that sounded like a seatbelt, secure but limiting. She remembered once during a family barbecue, a neighbor had complimented her presentation at a local leadership seminar. Before Eleanor could say thank you, Catherine had interjected with a laugh. "Oh, don't flatter her too much. Eleanor gets uncomfortable being in the spotlight." And she had laughed too, because what else could she do? Richard, her father, was no villain. He wasn't cruel, but he was quiet, always taking the path of least resistance. When Catherine spoke, he nodded. When Eleanor once complained years ago that she felt overshadowed, Richard had only put his hand gently on her shoulder and said, "You know your mother has her ways. You understand her, don't you?" As if understanding were enough. As if it were her job to be the one who always understood. And Eleanor had done exactly that. She had understood. She had stepped back. She had made room. Over and over again. When Madeline needed a spotlight, Eleanor dimmed her own. When Madeline fell apart during her first failed engagement, Eleanor helped her pack and never said "I told you so." When Catherine asked Eleanor to just be flexible with the wedding seating because Madeline had a little anxiety about where she'd sit, Eleanor had shifted names around without complaint. She was not treated cruelly. She was treated invisibly, and invisibility was harder to confront. It didn't leave bruises or broken glass. It left a quiet erosion of self-worth, the sense that you were tolerated rather than chosen, accepted rather than celebrated. Now, as she dragged in the last email thread into her restitution folder, something inside her shifted. Not rage, not sadness, just clarity. She had never truly been the daughter they wanted. She had been the rehearsal, the prototype, the quiet draft before the final script. She clicked open the audio file again and listened to her mother's voice one more time just to remind herself that she hadn't imagined it. Madeline is the long-term investment, Catherine had said. Eleanor paused the recording and leaned back in her chair. What kind of parent speaks that way about their children, who divides their family like a business portfolio? And then she realized this had never been about love. It had always been about optics, control, perception. Eleanor had refused to be managed. That was her greatest sin. She opened a spreadsheet and began cataloging the documents. She color-coded the timeline, dated each interaction, linked email subjects to file names. It was slow work, but she felt herself coming back into her body with each click. There was power here, power in knowledge, in preparation, in the act of saying, "You saw me as weak because I stayed quiet. But you forgot I was watching. I was remembering." When the document was organized, backed up 3 times and labeled with tags, Eleanor closed her laptop and finally stood. She looked around the room, the same walls, the same soft furniture, the same bookshelves filled with her carefully managed life. Only now the stillness didn't feel like a trap. It felt like a calm before something long overdue. Eleanor hadn't spoken to Daniel in over 24 hours. Not since she'd stood in her living room staring at the image of her sister in the very wedding dress Eleanor had commissioned, wearing it like it had always belonged to her. The silence between them wasn't accidental. It was weighty, deliberate. She hadn't been ready to hear what he might say, but now with the pieces falling together and the truth taking shape, she needed to know what he knew and what he hadn't told her. She dialed his number just after 7 p.m., her finger lingering over the screen for a second before pressing call. The line rang twice before he answered, his voice soft and cautious. "Hey, Elle." She didn't respond to the familiarity. "We need to talk. Now." There was a long pause, then a small breath. "Okay." She kept her tone even. "When were you going to tell me my mother gave you my medical records?" Silence. It was the kind of silence that didn't need explanation. It confirmed everything. Daniel began, his voice strained. "I didn't think she actually kept them. I thought she was bluffing when she said she'd send something, but then a few weeks ago she forwarded me a packet. It had evaluations, notes from when you were in college, nothing recent. It didn't feel right." Eleanor's throat tightened. She didn't need to hear every document title. She already knew what they were. When she was 21, she'd had a brief spell of anxiety triggered by overwork and exhaustion during grad school. She'd seen a counselor been prescribed a mild anti-anxiety medication and gradually moved past it. She hadn't hidden it, but she'd never thought it would be weaponized. She said Daniel continued that she thought I deserved to know, that you were private and wouldn't tell me, and that if we were going to spend a life together, I should go in with my eyes open. Eleanor exhaled slowly, her voice sharp but quiet. And did you? I didn't believe her, he said quickly, not the way she spun it. I know you, Eleanor. I know you're steady and smart and responsible, but you didn't tell me. His breath caught. I didn't want to hurt you. It felt loaded. Like if I brought it up, it would validate what she was trying to do. And then she brought up the prenup. Eleanor's eyebrows furrowed. What? She said we should consider a prenup, that it would protect me if anything about your mental health resurfaced. She was subtle about it, but I got the message. She wanted a clause that let me keep the house and the accounts if something went wrong. Eleanor blinked. And you didn't sign it, no? Of course not. I told her no, flat out. But you didn't tell me any of this, Daniel, she said, the steadiness in her voice beginning to fray. You let me plan a wedding with you. You watched me walk through every step of this, knowing my own mother had already begun tearing it down behind my back. You knew. I didn't know she'd cancel the wedding, Eleanor. I didn't know they'd do this to you. But you knew they saw me as unstable, as a liability. And you said nothing. There was a pause, then a quiet confession. I didn't want to be in the middle of it. I thought if we just got through the wedding, it would all calm down. I thought once we were married, they'd accept it. You thought I should just endure it in silence like I always have. His voice cracked. I didn't want to lose you. You didn't protect me either, she said. He didn't deny it. For a moment, Eleanor said nothing. The silence on the line wasn't angry. It was hollow. Final. When she finally spoke, it was without heat. You were the one person I thought I didn't have to defend myself to. The one person who didn't look at me like a risk. And you let them fill your head with doubts I earned my way out of years ago. Daniel tried again. I still want to marry you, Eleanor. I know, she replied. But now I need to decide whether I still want to marry you. Then calmly, she ended the call. She placed her phone face down on the table, her hands trembling not from rage but from the sheer weight of disappointment. This wasn't betrayal, not exactly. It was erosion. Trust once chipped didn't need to be smashed to crumble. Sometimes all it took was quiet omission. She stared at the folder labeled Restitution on her desktop. For the first time, she hovered over it and added a subfolder, Collateral Damage. And inside it, she saved a note titled, Daniel, silence isn't protection. It's complicity. It had been 4 days since Eleanor last spoke to Daniel. 4 days since she'd heard her mother's voice echoing through that old voicemail file. 4 days since she'd stopped crying, not because the pain had lessened, but because her emotions had hardened into something sharper, cleaner. She no longer felt like a woman drowning in betrayal. She felt like a strategist at a war table calmly assembling her pieces. That morning she dressed in her most neutral clothes, a gray turtleneck-pressed black trousers, and sat at the small dining table with her laptop, her phone, and a notepad. No music, no background noise, just order. The first call was to her bank. She was connected to a representative named June. Eleanor explained in a voice clear and composed that she wished to place a temporary hold on all outgoing payments connected to her wedding account. I understand, June said gently after Eleanor outlined the situation. May I ask, is this related to a dispute? It is, Eleanor replied. Fraudulent redirection of funds. The account is in my name and I have reason to believe charges were authorized using outdated legal permissions. June asked a few more questions, verified her identity, and within 20 minutes the account was frozen. Any pending vendor payments, catering, venue rental, photography were now halted. Eleanor requested written confirmation for each cancellation. She thanked June politely and ended the call. She took a slow breath, then turned to the folder of printed contracts she'd been gathering. Some were crisp and new, signed just a few months prior. Others were older, scanned from her files with marginal notes and initials. As she began comparing names, amounts, and dates, a pattern began to emerge. Several original contracts, venue, floral designer, even the rental company for the chairs had been amended. Her name had either been removed or changed to Monroe family account. Worse, some contracts now listed Madeline as the primary contact, with Eleanor's name struck through in digital annotations. But not all traces were gone. Some invoices still listed her as the original signatory. One floral deposit showed both her initials and Madeline's side by side, dated a month apart. It was sloppy work, an assumption that Eleanor wouldn't look twice. But she was looking now. Closely. She highlighted the inconsistencies, scanned everything into her laptop, and sorted them into subfolders within her growing restitution archive. Then she made the next call. Martha Calloway had once been the Monroe family's attorney. A sharp, detail-oriented woman in her late 60s, Martha had quietly stepped back from representing the family 5 years ago. Eleanor had always liked her. Unlike the newer legal consultants her parents used, Martha had never spoken to her like a fragile child. "Martha. It's Eleanor Monroe." There was a pause, then a surprised but kind response. "Well, I didn't expect to hear from you. I need legal advice. Not as a Monroe. As me." Martha hesitated only a moment. "What's going on?" Eleanor laid it out simply. She told her about the canceled wedding, the redirection of vendors, the financial accounts, the Instagram post of Madeline in her dress. She explained the amended contracts and, most importantly, the sense that something larger, more insidious had been happening behind the scenes. When she mentioned her suspicion about the use of an old power of attorney document, Martha fell silent. "You think your mother used it to reassign assets?" Martha asked carefully. "Yes," Eleanor said. "It was a general POA I signed when I was 19. I was studying abroad and thought I'd need someone to handle my accounts. That document would have expired with age or be subject to specific limitations depending on state law. Did you ever revoke it? No. I forgot it existed." Martha exhaled through the line. "If your mother used that to access or redirect your funds without your renewed consent, and especially for a personal benefit to another family member, that's not just unethical. It may be legally actionable." Eleanor didn't say anything for a long moment. The word actionable sat heavy in the room. "I need to see the paperwork," Martha said. "All of it. The contracts, the bank statements, the communication threads, everything you've got." "I've already digitized it," Eleanor replied. "I'll send it by secure drive this afternoon." There was a pause, then something steelier in Martha's tone. "Good." And Eleanor. "Yes." This wasn't carelessness. This was orchestration. If you're prepared to pursue this, you need to understand this will not be a clean fight. "I'm not looking for clean anymore," Eleanor said. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." She ended the call, her hand steady. For the first time in days, her body didn't feel heavy. Her mind didn't feel fogged. This wasn't rage or revenge. It was rebalancing, not screaming in the street, not smashing plates, just quiet, methodical reclamation. She looked down at her folder, now thick with proof, with names, with timestamps. Her family had erased her from a wedding. Now she was rewriting herself into the record, one document at a time. It took Eleanor 2 days to decide whether she would make it public. Not because she was afraid. That fear had burned itself out somewhere between her call to Martha and her 4th scanned invoice. No, this hesitation was strategic. The question wasn't if she would speak, it was how. She wasn't looking for pity. She didn't want gasps, hashtags, or performative outrage. What she wanted was precision, documentation, accountability. The internet could spin a story in 1,000 directions, but if she held the facts steady, it would have no choice but to land where she pointed. She opened a blank post on a platform where she rarely shared anything personal. Her profile was quiet, professional, largely untouched. That made it all the more powerful. Her fingers hovered for a moment, then began typing. This is not a story of betrayal. This is evidence of erasure. I was engaged to be married. I paid for the venue, selected the dress, booked the florist, the photographer, and coordinated every detail of what was supposed to be the most meaningful day of my life. Without my knowledge or consent, every decision I made was overridden. The wedding still happened, but not to me. My younger sister Madeline wore the dress I chose. She stood in the venue I reserved. She posed in front of the photographer I paid. My name was removed, replaced in every document as if I never existed. My mother orchestrated this with the help of a power of attorney I signed at 19 and forgot existed, used without my permission to divert funds and decisions in silence. Attached are redacted files, invoices, contracts, screenshots of communications. A voice recording from a family dinner last year. Emails with my name scratched out. I'm not sharing this for sympathy. I'm sharing it because erasure is not always loud. Sometimes it's polite, paper thin. It wears the face of tradition, of family, of what's best. But it is still theft, and for the first time in my life I'm saying not anymore. She paused before uploading the files. The Mao Je Hui Kui. The revised wedding timeline listing Madeline and Ethan. The invoice changes. A transcription of the voicemail, her mother calmly explaining to her father that if we need to shift Ethan to Madeline, we can. She didn't add commentary, just let the documents speak. The caption remained untouched. Then she clicked post. At first, nothing happened. An hour passed, then 3, then 10. By the next morning, she woke to 112,000 views. The shares came in waves. Comments flooded her inbox. People from every walk of life chimed in, strangers, professionals, trauma survivors, and adult children who had spent their lives quietly dimming themselves for the sake of family order. The post wasn't trending, not in the viral sense, but it had struck a deeper chord, the kind that moved slowly but stuck. Then came the message that shifted the ground again. A private inbox note from someone named Lisa Granger. We've never met, but I used to be your family's accountant. I was let go a few years ago when I questioned a few things I wasn't supposed to see. I kept copies, not out of spite, but because I didn't want to be complicit. If you're serious about pursuing this, I'm willing to help. Eleanor stared at the message for a long moment before replying. What kind of things? Lisa responded with an attachment and a short note. The Monroe Foundation. Your name was used to file the articles of incorporation, but the listed account doesn't belong to you. I can prove it was diverted. The file showed documents Eleanor had never seen before. A charitable fund established in her name with money funneled into a private account registered under a shell company linked back to Catherine. It wasn't just deception. It was fraud. Eleanor forwarded the document to Martha within minutes. The response was immediate. We have enough for financial misconduct. I'll contact the authorities and file an official complaint. This is no longer just a civil matter. 2 days later, a federal financial crimes investigator contacted Eleanor directly. Her original post had caught public attention, but now it had triggered something larger, a preliminary inquiry into potential embezzlement and misuse of legal instruments. The officer was polite, measured, and serious. He asked for more documents. She gave him everything. By the end of the week, the quiet scandal had reached local news. A well-known family with deep business ties now under scrutiny for financial irregularities tied to a daughter's canceled wedding. It was the kind of headline that made people pause, the kind that didn't just fade in a cycle. Eleanor didn't feel triumphant. Not yet. But she felt seen, and after a lifetime of erasure, that was a revolution in itself. The post from Catherine went live 3 days after Eleanor's. It wasn't addressed to anyone directly. It didn't name names. But the implication was unmistakable. The caption read, "When children are emotionally unstable, even love becomes ammunition against you." Attached was a photo from Thanksgiving 3 years prior, the whole Monroe family arms around each other, wine glasses raised, frozen in the glow of holiday harmony. Catherine's followers, mostly acquaintances, fellow charity patrons, suburban mothers who still called her Mrs. Monroe, poured into the comments with empathy. "You've always been such a devoted mother, praying for peace in your family." People forget how much parents sacrifice. Eleanor saw it all. She didn't flinch. But it cut. It wasn't just the post. It was the careful framing, the passive-aggressive sorrow, the tone of a mother wringing her hands in grief, implying her daughter's very public accusations were a symptom not of betrayal, but of mental imbalance. The family had weaponized silence against her for years. Now they were weaponizing pity. Richard, for his part, said nothing. No public comment, no calls, no emails. He remained the quiet orbit around Catherine's gravity just as he always had, the image of stability, of a man who lets the women in his life handle things. But it was Madeline's post that confirmed what Eleanor already knew: there would be no apology, no correction, no olive branch. Madeline's photo was filtered and perfectly timed. She stood beside Ethan, framed by soft white lights and delicate floral arrangements. Her caption was short: "A day full of love surrounded by those who truly care." No mention of Eleanor. No acknowledgement of the chaos. Just that final dig: those who truly care. The world tilted again, this time not with anger, but with the subtle ache of recognition. The Monroe family had chosen a narrative, not just privately, publicly, and they were doubling down. The real sting came hours later, not from her mother, not from Madeline, but from the quiet shift in her personal messages. A text from Claire, a friend from college. "Hey, I saw what's been going on. I don't want to take sides, but are you okay? Do you think maybe you're reading too much into things?" Another from Mark, a mutual acquaintance. "You sure this isn't about old family drama? I mean, Madeline's wedding looked beautiful. Maybe they didn't mean to hurt you." And then silence from others she had known for years. Friends who had liked every photo of her engagement ring, who had asked about flower colors and guest lists, now conspicuously absent from her notifications. People don't always abandon you with confrontation. Sometimes they leave by pulling away gently and without sound, as if backing out of a room they no longer feel comfortable in. It was the soft betrayal that stung most. By the end of the day, Eleanor had unfollowed a dozen accounts. Not in anger, not in some grand statement, just a quiet release. She didn't have room to carry anyone who mistook her clarity for chaos. She sat on the floor of her apartment that night, surrounded by folders, emails, documents, evidence of what had happened, yes, but also of who she had been forced to become in order to survive it. A woman who no longer begged to be believed. Eleanor didn't respond to Catherine's post. She didn't issue a rebuttal. She didn't craft a defense or release a second wave of receipts. Instead, she made a private note in her journal. "They needed the world to think I was fragile, because that's the only way their cruelty makes sense." Then she underlined the final line twice: "I am not fragile. I am the proof." The courthouse wasn't packed, but it was tense. Eleanor sat alone at the petitioner's table, her posture composed, folder labeled "Restitution" placed squarely before her. Her legal counsel, Martha Calloway, sat beside her, flipping through a stack of documents as methodically as a surgeon prepping for a delicate operation. Across the aisle, Catherine Monroe sat next to her attorney, dressed in gray silk, her expression a perfect blend of grief and civility. Richard sat behind her, unreadable. Madeline wasn't present. The Monroes had filed a lawsuit 2 weeks earlier, defamation, breach of family trust, and financial sabotage. The complaint painted Eleanor as an unstable daughter seeking revenge for perceived slights. They claimed her public accusations had caused irreparable harm to the Monroe family's reputation and standing. The courtroom was silent when the judge entered. Judge Harper was known for her no-nonsense style. She was seasoned, direct, and had a particular distaste for dramatics. Opening arguments were brief. Catherine's attorney leaned hard on Eleanor's social media post, accusing her of launching a smear campaign without proper channels. He emphasized the fragile mental health history Eleanor's mother had reluctantly disclosed, painting the public fallout as the result of emotional volatility. When it was Martha's turn, she stood calmly and said, "This case is not about bitterness. It is about identity theft, financial manipulation, and the systemic erasure of a woman's agency. We will present evidence that shows a coordinated effort to remove Ms. Eleanor Monroe from her own wedding and to exploit her identity and finances for personal gain." Then came the documents. Page by page, Martha guided the court through invoices, altered contracts, email chains showing venue vendors updating names at the request of Catherine Monroe. Voicemail transcripts were submitted. Eleanor didn't speak. She didn't need to. The evidence spoke for her. Halfway through the proceedings, Catherine's lawyer moved to dismiss the voicemail recording as inadmissible. Judge Harper overruled. When a party's own voice appears to confirm allegations central to the case, she said it deserves to be heard. And then, when the room was already charged with tension, the door opened. Daniel walked in. He looked thinner than she remembered, tired, but focused. He nodded once at Eleanor, not seeking forgiveness, just signaling something heavier: solidarity. Her attorney blinked in surprise as Daniel stepped forward. "Your Honor, I have material relevant to this case. Communications and recordings shared with me by Catherine Monroe during my engagement to Eleanor Monroe." Judge Harper allowed it. Daniel submitted a folder. Inside were printed emails from Catherine, one in particular with the subject line, "Prenup Discussion, Eleanor's Condition." In it, Catherine referred to Eleanor as an emotional liability and insisted that Daniel protect himself legally before the wedding. Another was a calendar invite sent to Daniel 3 weeks before Eleanor's planned wedding date titled Transition Plan, M+E. The body of the email included bullet points detailing how to replace Eleanor in the wedding planning infrastructure with minimal fallout. Then came the audio file. It was a phone call. Catherine's voice clear: "Eleanor doesn't know how to be center stage without falling apart. Madeline is poised. This family needs a future, not a meltdown at the altar." The courtroom was dead silent. Daniel turned to the judge. "I should have spoken sooner, but I was afraid. I thought keeping peace meant staying silent. I realize now that silence was complicity." Eleanor didn't look at him. She didn't need to. She kept her eyes on the judge, her hands folded neatly on the table, her breath steady. When the testimony concluded, Judge Harper recessed for deliberation. 37 minutes later, she returned with her ruling. This court finds sufficient evidence to reject the plaintiff's claims of defamation and reputational damage. Furthermore, based on documentation and sworn testimony, there is probable cause to investigate the misuse of financial instruments, including unlawful use of a power of attorney and charitable fraud. The courtroom held its breath. "I hereby issue a freeze on assets held under the Catherine Monroe Trust and any business entity bearing the Monroe name. A formal investigation will be opened into potential civil and criminal misconduct." Catherine went pale. Richard looked away. As the bailiff began handing down copies of the ruling, the quiet hum of voices rippled through the room. By the time Eleanor stepped outside, her phone was vibrating nonstop. News outlets had picked up the story. Heiress lawsuit turns tables. Bride replaced by sister court. Uncovers financial scandal. When family becomes the villain. Eleanor didn't smile. She didn't gloat. But as she stepped into the sunlight, her steps were lighter. For the first time in her life, Eleanor Monroe wasn't asking to be heard. She had been heard. And the world was finally listening. Eleanor hadn't been back to her parents' home since the hearing. But a week after the ruling, she returned not for reconciliation, not for drama, just for closure. She arrived early in the morning before the world had fully woken. The house looked exactly as it always had: pristine lawn, white shutters, the kind of place that radiated the illusion of perfection. A house where holidays were posed and problems were politely ignored. She let herself in with the key she still carried. The air was stale, unused. Or maybe it just felt unfamiliar now that she no longer belonged to it. She walked through the hallway past the family portraits, the formal living room with untouched furniture, the oak-paneled study where her father used to sit behind unread books. On the kitchen counter, she placed a manila envelope. Inside the house key, a formal letter of property release, and a single sentence in her handwriting. I release myself from this place. It wasn't for legal drama. The court had already ruled. But Eleanor knew something deeper had to be undone, not just contracts and balances, but attachments. The invisible ropes. She didn't linger. A week later, a certified envelope arrived at her apartment. Inside was a check issued by the county court on behalf of the Monroe estate, reimbursing the full cost of her original wedding planning venue deposits, catering fees, dress fittings, and miscellaneous charges. The amount was substantial. She didn't deposit it. Instead, she took the check to a framing shop. She had it matted on ivory paper mounted in a dark walnut frame and hung it in her hallway above her desk. When her neighbor asked why anyone would hang a check on their wall, Eleanor smiled and said, "Because some receipts don't belong in a bank. They belong where I can see them." That same week, she launched the nonprofit. It had taken nights of planning and 100 edits to the mission statement. But the name came easily. Wells and Gray, her grandmother's maiden names. Women who, as family lore told it, had raised children in silence, borne secrets for the sake of appearances, and disappeared into the background of their husbands' legacies. Wells and Gray, legal voice for women undone by family control. The website was spare, professional, quietly powerful. It offered consultation resources, legal education, and referrals to attorneys who specialized in undue influence, coercive control, and estate manipulation. Eleanor didn't want to build an empire. She just wanted to make sure the next woman didn't have to walk alone. Within the first month, 3 women reached out. One was in her 60s, cut out of a will after caring for both parents full-time. Another, a newlywed who had been convinced to sign over her inheritance to support her brother's startup. And the third was someone Eleanor hadn't expected. Linda. Her old friend, the one who had sent the Instagram photo of Madeline in her stolen dress. They met for coffee at a quiet place on the west side of town, the kind of place they used to frequent in their 20s before everything turned heavy. Linda looked different. Stronger, maybe. But tired. "I never told you," she said, stirring her coffee without looking up, "but Catherine interfered in my job offer 3 years ago, said I wasn't appropriate company for you. She contacted my potential employer. I lost the offer." Eleanor didn't react with shock. "Not anymore," Linda continued. "I didn't say anything back then because I didn't want to believe it. But I think I needed you to name it first before I could admit it happened to me too." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Eleanor reached into her bag and handed her a Wells and Gray pamphlet. "Then, let's start there." By the end of the month, Linda had joined the advisory circle. They worked together on case reviews, helped write guidelines for recognizing subtle family manipulation, and hosted a live-streamed panel that drew hundreds of viewers. Eleanor wasn't trying to be a symbol. She wasn't interested in being anyone's hero. But as she walked back into her apartment one evening, passing the framed check on the wall, she realized something had shifted. For so long, she had carried her pain as proof of survival, of betrayal, of loss. But now she was building something from it. Not in spite of it, but because of it. She placed her bag on the hook, sat at her desk, and opened a new file. The next chapter wasn't about Catherine, or Madeline, or even Daniel. It was about what a woman could build after being told she had no place. The first request came from a local morning show, soft-lighting sympathetic hosts, a polished 5-minute segment about resilience. They wanted Eleanor to sit on their couch, tell her story, inspire their viewers with what they called her quiet courage. She declined. Not because she wasn't proud of what she had done, but because she knew the danger of letting a spotlight become a stage. "I didn't speak to be celebrated," she told the producer gently over the phone. "I spoke to end something, so others wouldn't have to stay quiet." She hung up, then deleted the request. More offers followed. Podcasts, editorials, even a docuseries pitch from a streaming network. But Eleanor turned them all down. She wasn't interested in becoming a cautionary tale or a trending hashtag. She had already been erased once she wasn't about to let another narrative take her over again. A month after her nonprofit launched, an email arrived. It was from Madeline. It was short, No subject line. Just 3 lines of text. I know I can't undo what happened. I didn't want it not like that. Mom said it was the only way to save the house. I thought if I said no, everything would fall apart. Eleanor stared at the screen. For a long time, she didn't respond. When she did, her reply was as measured as it was honest. I believe you were caught in something much bigger than either of us. But I'm not here to make you feel better. If you want to be free, you need to start telling the truth. Not to me, to the court, and to yourself. There was no reply. At least not right away. A few days later, another email came. A promise. Vague. Acknowledging wrongdoing, expressing regret. Madeline said she would speak to her attorney. Said she wanted to fix things. Eleanor didn't hold her breath. People don't change because you ask them to. They change when they're ready. And sometimes they don't change at all. But Eleanor wasn't waiting for redemption. She was already moving on. In the weeks that followed, she focused on Wells and Gray, meeting with new advisors, reviewing intake forms, speaking softly over Zoom to women who were still learning that being controlled isn't the same as being cared for. She spoke at a law school quietly without cameras, just a handful of students and a professor who'd read her case and invited her to share what didn't make the court transcripts. What it felt like. What it cost. She ended that talk with a line she hadn't rehearsed, but one that stayed with them. You don't have to be perfect to be believed. You just have to keep your records and your courage in the same drawer. Back at her apartment, the hallway was quiet. The check still hung on the wall, framed and untouched. Its value hadn't changed, but its meaning had deepened. It wasn't about money. It was about proof. That something had happened. That it mattered. That she mattered. As she walked past it one evening, a glass of tea in hand, she paused and looked at it the way one might look at an old scar. Familiar, faintly painful, but hers. She thought of the girl she used to be, the one who apologized too often, who bent herself into the shape of other people's comfort, who mistook silence for strength. And she thought of the woman she had become. Someone who didn't need to raise her voice to be heard. Someone who no longer mistook peace for submission. Someone who no longer told herself to be small in rooms that wanted her silent. She didn't cry, but she smiled. Not big, not triumphant, just enough. Enough to know that this chapter, whatever came next, would be hers to write. And as the evening light shifted, casting a soft reflection of her face in the glass over that check, she whispered one final thought to the version of herself who had once stood in a silent kitchen reading a note on a fridge. I used to live to keep quiet. Now I live so no one else has to. If you've stayed with this story until now, maybe something in Eleanor's journey echoed inside you too. Not everyone born into a family is given the love or respect they deserve. Sometimes the deepest wounds come from the people we were taught to trust the most. But all it takes is one person willing to speak up and silence loses its power. This isn't just Eleanor's story. It's for anyone who has ever been erased from their own life and found the courage to reclaim it, not to be accepted, but to stand on their own terms. If you've been through something similar or know someone who has, please share your story in the comments. Your words might be the strength someone else needs right now. And if stories like this move you, stories of betrayal, justice, and quiet revenge, then subscribe to this channel. Every week we bring you powerful real-life dramas that prove one thing: the truth always finds its voice. Do you think Eleanor was right not to forgive Madeline right away? What would you have done in her place? I'd truly love to hear what you think.